Namaste, everyone. Welcome back to our next podcast as part of the EkaShri organization. We are interested in having you all join us today to discuss the next limb of Ashtanga Yoga, the Niyamas. But before we do so, just wanted to spend 30 seconds really quickly recapping the podcast. So we're aiming to have a couple of 30 to 45-minute episodes on a wide variety of different topics within yoga philosophy. And as we've discussed in the past, the goal of the podcast isn't to just give textbook lectures on a topic, but rather to explore it in an accessible way and focus on what the real-world applications of these topics really are. And so to the extent you have any questions, you have any topics that you would like to address or would like to just give any feedback or comments, feel free to let us know at info@ekashri.yoga and let us know. And we'd be happy to incorporate this into our agenda for the subsequent podcast. So with that, I have with me Shriram ji, of course. And with that, why don't we go ahead and delve into the next limb of Ashtanga Yoga, the Niyamas. So Shriram ji, today, right, we're going to be continuing our discussion of the yamas and niyamas, this time with the focus starting on the niyamas, as we touched upon the yamas last weekend. So at its core, what does the word niyama actually mean? And if you can bring in the Sanskrit meaning behind the word, as well as what that loosely translates to into the English vernacular, that would be good to, I think, get us started.
Namaste everyone, and Namaste Vedant. So usually when people talk about yamas, they also club together niyamas as well. In other words, they talk about these two limbs of the Ashtanga Yoga as a pair. They go hand in hand because each of them list 5 values to practice. And as we saw last week, yama literally means control. And we saw that the 5 yamas that Patanjali mentions are a way to bring harmony when we deal with the world. So we deal with the world from a place of non-violence, we express truth, etc. So the objective of the yamas is so that we are in harmony with the outside world. The outside world doesn't provoke us. We are in harmony. And the niyamas, the word niyama itself is, it's interesting. It is the same yama with a prefix. In Sanskrit, it's called upasarga. Upasarga of ni. Ni plus yama. Ni stands for nitaram, which means eternally or stably. Eternally in a place of control. And niyama is usually interpreted as rules and regulations. So not just in Sanskrit, but in many Indian languages, this word niyamam or niyama is very commonly used to refer to rules or guidelines, good habits, you can say, that when we espouse those habits, it allows us to make progress in the chosen path. For example, the path that we choose as yoga practitioners is to make progress in the path of yoga. And so what are the good habits we can cultivate so that it helps us on our path? It doesn't put brakes on the path, but it helps us accelerate or aid us in making progress. So that's what niyamas are. So niyamas we can think of as guidelines or rules that help us along the path of yoga.
Perfect. And so, before we get into what the specifics of the actual niyamas are, is it fair to say, or how would you characterize between the yamas and the niyamas, the sort of how much of it is more external, facing or external focused versus internal focused, if you will? So I know we've, in the past discussed that among the 8 limbs of Ashtanga Yoga more broadly, we don't really see it as a progression from one to the other because they all are interdependent to a certain extent and you rely on one for the other too. But would you say that the niyamas are a little bit more, because there are these rules or guidelines that you mentioned, is that more of an internal set of rules versus external with the yamas, or how would you think about that characterization?
So the way my teacher used to talk about this shade of difference between yamas and niyamas, the objective of yamas is to be in harmony with the outside world. Let's take an example. The first yama, as we saw last week, was ahimsa, non-violence. Now, if we disregard ahimsa, and if somebody expresses violence in their action, then it is fair to assume that they will see a similar response being meted out to them. So when we are angry with somebody and we express an insult to them, perhaps that insult will come back to that person. So they will respond in kind. So the niyamas, on the other hand, it is not so much as externally focused. For example, the first niyama is Shoucha, which is cleanliness. So if we keep our house unclean, for example, it is not somebody that is going to be mad at us. It is not that we are breaking the law, for example. It is just that for our own personal harmony, it is a good idea to keep the home clean, like physical cleanliness, etc. So we are not uh, promoting the disharmony to the society, but for the sake of our own well-being, it helps us. So that is the shade of difference. Whereas yamas are more externally focused, how we deal with the world and how the world responds to us. We evoke the best from the world when we are non-violent to the world, we are truthful to the world, etc. Whereas niyamas are for our own benefit. We create a space where health and harmony can more easily blossom in our environment.
And I think thanks for sharing that. That's a very interesting distinction to make. And I think, it just goes to further, I think, really underscore the fact that these are guidelines which are sort of more internally enforced, right, as opposed to externally enforced. And to a certain extent, right, there are shades of gray on this, like you mentioned, right, where we can have, for example, on the concept of ahimsa, right, nonviolence. If you're going to be, actively going out and looking to harm someone, obviously there are societal guidelines that are against that. But then to the concept of not doing self-harm, right, so things that, and there's again a whole shade of gray in terms of how much that gradient goes towards self, harm versus being maybe just a sort of minor shallower thing. But again, those are things that are not enforced societally, but rather internally enforced. So I think it's really interesting to bring up that point about you have certain rules that you live by in society, but then these are really rules that are also very internally driven, and that's something that you need to keep in mind. No one's going to be forcing you to keep your room clean or keep your environment clean, but at the same time, it's something that needs to be driven internally. Otherwise, it won't happen. So with that, why don't we go ahead and actually delve into what the actual core niyamas are? And so there are 5 different niyamas: Shoucha, Santosha, Tapas, Swat Dhaya, and Ishvara Pranidhana. So would you mind, Shriramji, explaining at a high level what each of these different elements are and what exactly do they mean?
Yes, so just like Patanjali enumerated 5 yamas, he enumerates 5 niyamas as well, the 5 rules or regulations to abide by. So the first one, as we saw a few moments back, is Shoucha, which is derived from the word Shuchi, which simply means clean or pure, purity or cleanliness. And of course, this can be interpreted in a variety of ways: purity or cleanliness in the environment, cleanliness in the body, cleanliness in the mind. In other words, keeping the mind clear, not clogged with confused thoughts and so forth. So that is Shaucha, the first niyama. Second one is Santosha. Santosha means contentment. Usually Santosha is translated as contentment. You can also say the feeling of being happy. And this is interesting because Patanjali gives this as a rule. So what does being happy mean? Usually we assume that we become happy when some events happen or when I acquire something, etc. But what Patanjali reminds us here is that happiness is a discipline to abide by. The responsibility of keeping oneself happy lies in our hand. It is not because some object can bring happiness to us, but we evoke it from within. So taking charge of our happiness to make oneself happy, only I can do it myself. So taking charge of that, that is Santosha. The third one is Tapas. Tapas is a very interesting word. Usually it's translated as austerity or discipline. The literal meaning of the word tapas is heat, or to cook something, to heat something. Now, what does it mean? We'll get into it a little bit deeper in a few moments, but just to broach the topic a little bit, it is the willingness to go outside of our comfort zone for the sake of growth. In order to make progress in something, the willingness to step out of our comfort zone. When we step out of our comfort zone, we feel a little bit of heat because it's uncomfortable. The willingness to go through some discomfort for the sake of long-term joy. That's what tapas is. And we will look at it a little more after some time. And then the fourth niyama is Swat Dhaya. Swat Dhaya comes from two words, swa, which means self, and adhyayanam means study. Study, or it literally means chapters. So you study, analyze, part by part, chapter by chapter, study. So self-study is what Swadhyaya is. And it can be interpreted in two ways. Swadhyaya can be interpreted in two ways. One is self-inspired study of that subject. For example, if I'm studying yoga, then proactively reading texts on yoga, the classic texts on yoga, or whatever subject is we are interested in, taking proactive steps to study that subject. That is Swadhyaya. So that is one meaning, self-inspired study of that subject. It can also be interpreted as study of the self, like who am I? Inquiry into who am I? So self-study can also mean study of the self. Who am I? What is this body? Why am I here? These universal questions, big questions, one could say. So this inquiry and contemplation, not to find a ready-made answer, but to inquire, make this inquiry as part of our sadhana or discipline. This is Swadhyaya. And then the last one is Ishvara Pranidhana. Ishvara Pranidhana. Pranidhana means a special devotion or surrendering or devotion. And usually we use the word bhakti for devotion, but Patanjali in the Yoga Sutras, he uses the word pranidhana, and which later scholars, they describe the word pranidhana as bhakti vishesha, which literally means special devotion, very high devotion. And the word Ishvara in the Ishvara pranidhana is a little bit complex because people usually interpret the word Ishvara as God. But the way Patanjali defines Ishvara is an ideal person, ideal being. For example, if I were living my life the best way I can, living the full potential, the highest vision of who I am, I'm living it. For example, on the New Year's Day, if I make a resolution, okay, I'm going to do this practice yoga every day. And if I live by it, so the ideal version of oneself, that is the same as Ishvara. We can think of the best part of ourselves, the best version of ourselves is the same as Ishvara. So that is how we will get into it in one of the future podcast sessions, like what is Ishvara and so forth. But for now, for the sake of exploring the Niyamas, we can say that Ishvara Pranidhana is the devotion or yearning to be the best of ourselves. You see, there is something that draws us towards being the best version of ourselves. So we can interpret Ishvara Pranidhana as the devotion or the yearning, the love to be the best of who I am. That is one way to look at it. But even if we interpret it as devotion to a being called Ishvara, whether that being, we call it God or some ideal person, it doesn't matter. That is also a good practice. Devotion to something or someone is a high ideal as well.
Got it. So I think there's a lot to unpack here, a lot of very interesting explanations that don't necessarily fit the standard, one-line definition if you were to just go look up these terms. And so I think, why don't we start at the beginning? Let's go ahead and start with Shoucha, cleanliness, because this is probably the most, again, when I say most straightforward, it's still a gradient and there's a lot to really, dice and slice here. But when it comes to cleanliness, right? So I think we have a good understanding. I don't want to spend too much time on this just because there are a lot more complicated explanations to decipher on the other terms. But I think cleanliness here, when you think about it, there's that external and internal cleanliness, right? So like you mentioned. And so it's not enough to just live in an environment, right? Where you have, for example, a clean room, you have a clean, let's just say a clean car, just cleanliness around you. But internally, if you don't have cleanliness, right? That's also another thing. So things like, simple things, right? Showering every day, things like washing your hands periodically, things like keeping yourself well groomed, right? So that goes hand in hand with, yoga practice, because obviously you can try to meditate as much as you want. You can focus on the pranayama practices, asanas, whatever have you. But at the end of the day, if you're not, achieving this goal of cleanliness, both internally and externally, that sort of is an impediment to your practice and your goal of being able to reach that ultimate higher state of being, right? So I think on that point, this is probably, I would say, the easiest of the niyamas to interpret. And I think we all in our audience definitely would understand both the importance of both internal and external cleanliness. So why don't we leave that there? That's definitely a very interesting
So
thing.
just to add
Yeah.
a bit on that, so even the practices such as the pranayama and the asanas, we can think of those practices as cleansing the body and the cleansing the pranic body as well, you see. So those practices also cleanse the system. Meditation cleanses the mind. As I said before, when the mind is cluttered, just like a room can be cluttered, the mind can also be cluttered with confused thoughts or too many thoughts. We are not able to see things clearly. So in order to cleanse the clog in the mind, meditation is an excellent practice. So we can actually use these practices as Shoucha to cleanse the body, to cleanse the mind, and so forth.
And I
And
think
another point about the Shoucha is we have all experienced this ourselves, isn't it? Like when we keep the room clean, we notice that I'm able to think clearly as well. Externally, when things are organized, when things are supposed to be where they are, properly placed, organized, and somehow it organizes the thoughts in the mind as well. So it reflects in how we think as well.
Yeah, and to the second point, definitely, right, minimizing distractions, for example, and helping build that focus. And to the first point you mentioned, right, I think that just further underscores how interrelated and interdependent these different limbs within Ashtanga Yoga, is, right? So for example, like you mentioned meditation, you mentioned pranayama practices as cleansing techniques. And I was thinking of, for example, even the Trataka practice, right? Where you have the focus on the candle or the light, and then that's supposed to help with, cleansing vision and stuff. So again, it just shows how interdependent, right? All these different limbs are together, and you can, each one sort of seems to be a building block for the other. And right, you kind of need all of them together to a certain extent in order to actually achieve that next level of being or that next level of awareness. And so I think just, very interesting comments around how all of these different pieces fit together, even when we're just taking one component of the niyamas. So why don't we leave that there, and why don't we move on to santosha? And so here you made an interesting point about how happiness lies in our hands. So I interpreted that as, of course, we're moving away from materialism. So materialistic things, right, don't actually give us pleasure and don't give us happiness. But how do you think about when happiness lies in our hands? That's not the most easiest of human emotions to actually internalize and act upon. So how do you think about, controlling happiness internally as opposed to external, manifestations or external goods driving happiness? So how should we or the audience be thinking about that?
So one of the insight that comes, especially with the practice of yoga, when the mind is able to delve into more subtle thoughts, like when we inquire about what makes me happy, what is the source of happiness, is it the objects from outside that brings me happiness, etc. Then at some point, we discover ourselves in this inquiry that the happiness doesn't reside elsewhere. For example, if one chocolate cake brings me X amount of happiness, if our happiness is indeed in that object, then 2 chocolate cakes should bring me 2x happiness, and 10 chocolate cakes should bring 10x happiness. It should scale proportionally. But we don't see that, right? We don't see that. If we gorge 100 chocolate cakes, it's not going to bring us great joy. And so we soon discover that the joy is something that resides within. And when we inquire into how we can produce that happiness from within, one of the analogy that they give is, it is as if a millionaire has forgotten where their treasure is in the house. They're forgotten. And they're living a life of poverty. And somebody reminds them, oh, the abundance, the treasure that you are seeking is in your own home. And they're surprised, but they forgot where they hid. They themselves hid the treasure somewhere, and they're trying to find it. And that is the predicament that is given as an analogy. All of us are in that situation. Where is my happiness? It is within, yes, but where it is hiding within. And that's where all these practices help. When we practice meditation, the asanas, all the limbs of yoga, the Ashtanga Yoga, then we are able to access the subtler realms that previously were hidden from us. So we are able to have clarity on, okay, where does happiness reside? How can I bring myself this happiness, produce this happiness from within? How can I create happiness, discover happiness, and express it from within? So that comes in due course of time, that realization.
And Shriramji, so if someone has been going through, let's just say, unfortunate circumstances, whatever it may be, some kind of illness, economic consequences, whatever it may be, how do you think about getting in the frame of mind to maintain that happiness when the circumstances may be such that you naturally would be unhappy, disappointed, feel the opposite sentiment? So how should you think about reconciling your environment with this internal state of happiness?
That's an excellent point, right? And it's a very deep question. And of course, here we are not talking about a frivolous happiness, to ignore what's happening outside and I'm just going to jump up and down. It's not like that kind of frivolous happiness. So santosha is actually contentment, and it can be interpreted as being in a state of balance. For example, when we are faced with a challenge, which state of mind do you think will be most helpful to find a creative solution to deal with that challenge? A calm and centered place of mind, or an agitated, fearful, or anxious state of mind? So when the mind is agitated, we don't have access to creative thoughts or intuition from which we can come up with new ideas to tackle that challenge, you see? So even from a practical standpoint, being centered helps even in dire situations. Because when our mind is centered, then we are able to come up with new ideas. We still have access to creativity. Now, it is easier said than done, right? And that is why when we practice this every day, when we practice the asanas, meditation, pranayama, etc., when such a situation does come, when a challenge does present itself, we are prepared. We know how to handle our mind. So the mind is more likely centered. Otherwise, it can get uprooted. It can uproot itself from the self, and it might be agitated, you see. So yes, even in situations of challenge, keeping the mind centered is helpful even when we look at it from a practical standpoint.
And I think that's very true, right? It's hard to maintain that level of thinking, which is why it's important to really internalize these concepts. Because if you think about it, like exactly how you said it, right? I mean, rationally speaking, if you're facing some kind of crisis or predicament, you want to have a clear mind and think it through, because that'll ultimately allow you to be more efficient in getting to that solution, rather than if you're agonizing about it, you won't think clearly, it'll be inefficient for you to get to a solution, you'll be emotional. So very true. I just think it's important for us to recognize that it's natural for us to be feeling these kind of emotions, when we're faced with these negative consequences or negative situations. But also the fact that, we really need to, I think, internalize this stuff before we face these kind of crises and consequences, so that we're prepared when we do ultimately face them, to know that you have two ways of acting. One is with a clear, cool head, and you can figure out a way to respond intellectually and, rationally to a particular problem. Or, you kind of throw all of this information by the highway and then keep going, emotionally, you're a mess, you're a wreck, you don't know what's going on. And then from there, you just struggle to even, cope with that particular situation. So I think that's food for thought for our audience to chew on, and definitely think about why we can say all this stuff, in this podcast, but it's really important. So, to internalize this and actually think about it, so that when you are presented with a situation where you have to choose between the normal human emotions of, like we discussed, those negative emotions, versus thinking coolly and calmly, you're prepared to make that decision in order to then find a solution to the particular adversity or problem that you're dealing with. So
yes, in fact, sooner or later, people face challenges, right? I remember
correct.
when my teacher used to give talks on yoga, like when he was giving introduction to yoga to large audience. One of the first questions he used to ask was, is there anybody in the audience who has not experienced a stressful event? And nobody will raise their arms, because as human beings, we all have encountered situations that were challenging. And how do we deal with them? And how can we deal with them in future? So that's where this practice of Santosha helps.
Definitely. And so I think, why don't we leave that topic with our audience? Let them, I would encourage the audience, I'm sure you would, to really think about that concept, right? So that next time you're presented with a situation where you have, two ways to act emotionally or, rationally and coolly and calmly, you can kind of think ahead of time and figure out how you would react, as opposed to kind of going with how the normal human reactions would be at the moment. So definitely food for thought. So moving on to tapas, right? So with tapas, what's interesting here, you mentioned the literal definition is actually heat. And I like how you parlayed that into the sense of, on a more abstract level, that word heat actually means willingness to go outside your comfort zone to get growth, for that thing of long-term joy. So, tapas, when you think about it stereotypically, right, this is, the connotation that comes to my head is, for example, a sage going to a forest, retreating there, meditating there for years, tens of years on end. And you have that sense of the word tapas, right? The most basic stereotypical definition. But at a more practical level, it also seems to be, right, devotion to a certain goal, devotion to a certain practice that you find interesting in order to achieve that long-term personal growth long-term. And so am I thinking about it correctly in the second way? And if so, what would you say with tapas is something that we all need to consider when we think about bringing that word to certain goals or aspirations that we may have as individuals?
You are right, Vedanji. In fact, all of us have gone through some amount of tapas. For example, when we enroll ourselves, say, in a graduate study, when we go to a college and we enroll ourselves for several semesters, we write exams, right? So in the moment, it might be uncomfortable preparing for exams and staying late in the night to study the things, so to prepare ourselves, etc. So in the moment, there is some discomfort, but in the long term, it is beneficial. So that is the tapas. That's how tapas we already practice in our life. So the basic idea of tapas is that we look for opportunities where we can find ways to expand or grow, and perhaps in the short term go through some discomfort. So proactively looking for situations like this is tapas. And going back to the literal definition of heat, tapas means heat. So one of the greatest clarity that I have got on the subject of tapas is from one of my teachers, Sri Ravi Shankarji. So he gives very easy way to understand how we can use heat for tapas. So for example, when we talk about heat or fire, Ayurveda talks about the process of digestion as heat in the stomach. It's called a Jataragni, the fire of digestion, right? Now, this fire, for example, can be used to cleanse the system when we fast. So fasting is a tapas, you see. So when we fast, we are using the Agni, the fire in the stomach. Of course, this is a metaphorical fire, right? There's not a literal fire that we are a flame. So this Jataragni is helping to cleanse the system. It purifies the system. Just like when we consume food, when we cook the food, it destroys the germs. So like that, here we are using the fire to literally do tapas on the food for the sake of bringing cleanliness. It purifies the food. So, Patanjali in the Yoga Sutras, he says that with the practice of tapas, it has two benefits. One is tapas purifies the system. That heat, when we go through that heat, it purifies the system. Just like the analogy with the food that we saw. And the second benefit is tapas also brings the organs of the body to function in their peak form, 100% efficiency. None of the organs of the body are working in a lukewarm fashion. They are all in their peak functioning capacity. So he says, Kaya Indriya Siddhihi Ashuddhikshaya Tapasaha. So tapas brings the strength in the body. In other words, the organs are functioning in their peak form and it cleanses the system. Ashuddhikshaya cleanses and purifies the system. So Shoucha again we see here. Tapas purifies the system. And so it's interesting how they all tie together.
Yeah, no, definitely. And thank you for bringing that up. I think that's a very interesting concept to bridge that literal definition of fire, right, with the actual goal and concept of tapas. And so, I think the concept of tapas, right, it also feeds a little bit into Swat Dhaya, right, that whole self-reflection and analysis, right, more broadly, right? So we have the literal definition, which is studying, for example, if you are thinking about it in a pure educational manner, right, you can open up a textbook, read about a topic, and you have that very physical level of Swat Dhaya. But why don't we focus a little bit more on the second, more abstract definition, right, the whole self-study and inquiry of the self. So with Swat Dhaya, what does that, studying the self, right? I have ideas about what that may be, but what does that actually mean? What does it mean to study the self?
So let's explore this in two ways. One is, so as you brought the subject of Swat Dhaya from tapas, that's very interesting because that is one way to look at Swat Dhaya. When we talk about tapas, we need to adjust the level of tapas so that it doesn't become a torture to the system. You see, too much tapas can destroy the system. It's like too much cooking the food will overcook the food and it becomes unpalatable. You see, so we need the right amount of tapas. We need to adjust that. And how do we know what is the optimal tapas we need? That's where Swat Dhaya comes in. We are aware. If I practice, say, 1 hour of yoga asanas every day, it benefits me so much. If I up the time for asanas and make it 2 hours, does it increase the benefit or does it tire the body? You see, being aware of what is happening in the body, how does the body and mind respond to the level of tapas that I practice? So that awareness is also Swat Dhaya. Being self-aware, how these practices affect the body and mind. Even what we eat. If I eat this food item, does the body feel light and agile? Does it provide nutrition to the body? Does my mind feel clear? Or do I find myself experiencing heaviness in the body or tummy ache? You see, that is also Swat Dhaya. How is the body and the mind, how are they responding to different actions, either some practices that we do in yoga or even eating the different food items and so forth. So that is one aspect of Swat Dhaya, being self-aware. The second is also the self-enquiry, enquiry into some of the big questions. Who am I and where am I? What is the function of this whole universe? Why am I here? What am I supposed to do? All these big questions and the inquiry into that. And as part of the inquiry, the study of different texts will help, because different texts give their perspectives. What do the great sages have to say? And perhaps they give contradictory views. Different people offer different views, but just to explore the different perspectives that we have been endowed as humanity. There are so many great sages have given wise perspectives on this subject, on the nature of the self and so forth. So to study them, to discover who I am. So that is also a part of Swat Dhaya. And of course, direct meditation. Like when we quiet the mind, what do I see? Or what happens? What thoughts or ideas about myself? How is it when I abide in myself? So this level of Swadhyayanam, that means this level of self-discovery or self-analysis, is also part of this practice.
No, thank you for wonderfully explaining that. I think that's very interesting the way you put it. And I didn't realize going in that, too much of tapas, for example, can be a negative thing. And I like the analogy you mentioned about how it's like akin to overcooking food, right? In a microwave, for example, where you lose the nutrients, you lose the benefits of that food. So that's very interesting. I guess my follow-up question would then be, for, stereotypically this definition, right? You see all the sages retreating to the forest and, meditating for years, decades on end. I guess if there's a 5-second explanation of how does that fit with that picture of them doing that? If too much tapas, for example, is not good for you, would be my question. And I know we're running short on time, so if there's a 5-second explanation, that'd be great. If not, we can maybe have a conversation about that some other time.
Yeah, definitely we'll explore on a future podcast episode. But many of the terms such as tapas or even samadhi, for example, we usually associate with, okay, this is meant for sages in the forest. It is not meant for people who live a regular life. But when we study the Yoga Sutras and all these classic yoga texts, we discover that, oh, they can actually be applied in day-to-day regular life. And for example, when we read about the different states of samadhi, we find, oh, I've experienced that before. Maybe a few moments of joy I had, oh, this is this type of samadhi. So like that, we find that it is not reserved just for people who retreat into the forest, but they can be applied in our daily life as well.
Got it. Very interesting. So I think we can touch upon that a little bit more comprehensively in another discussion. But last, but not least, let's talk about Ishvara Pranidhana. And I really like the way you put it, because coming into this discussion, I thought, with the word Ishvara, right, you would think that this is something that is a focus, a devotion towards God or the higher being. But your point about how this really is a representation of trying to be an ideal person, trying to push yourself towards being that ideal, individual, living your life with your full potential. So how does that, when we think of the word Ishwar, right, literally it means God. So is that the way our audience should be thinking about Ishvara Pranidhana, or how exactly, living your life to your full potential, how should we think about that in this concept, right? So does that mean just kind of pushing yourself as much as you can towards getting that next milestone, that next goal? Or can we just basically unpack this concept a little bit more and from the perspective of what it means to really reach your full potential?
In fact, it's so nice how they all fit together beautifully. Trying to be the best version of who we are is basically tapas. You see, I'm disciplined to be the best version of who I am, and following through with that vow is basically tapas. And what Ishvara Pranidhana brings is our yearning. It brings the emotion. Ishvara Pranidhana brings the emotion. We refine that emotion to that of devotion. So we bring that love, that devotion to be the best of who I am. Now, when we talk about Ishvara and how it is interpreted and so forth, because Ishvara and the word God especially is so overloaded. People have so much associated meanings with them. In one of the future sessions, we will look into how Patanjali describes Ishvara. Who is Ishvara? Patanjali actually describes that. Now, when we talk about the ideal person or the ideal version of, say, one's own self, the benefit of keeping our awareness on the ideal version of ourselves is whatever object or person we pour our awareness towards, we keep thinking about them all the time, our mind becomes like that. And one of my teachers, Sri Ravi Shankarji, he gives a very beautiful analogy. If you pour water into a container, the water takes the shape of the container, right? Like that, wherever we pour our awareness, our mind becomes like that. So when we keep thinking about a person who is always angry, to give an example, we become angry sooner or later because our awareness, if you think of our awareness as a liquid, like water, you pour your awareness there in the container and soon it takes the same shape. It becomes angry. This is a truth that is given in the Yoga Sutras as well. Patanjali says that knowing this truth, he says, Vitaraga Vishayam Vachittam, there is a sutra. He says, pour your awareness to somebody who inspires you. You see, because by doing that, we imbibe the same qualities. And Ishvara is that person who is like a role model, like a perfect person. So when we keep thinking about such a person, then our mind also takes the same form. We imbibe the same qualities as well. And it comes from a place of devotion, that yearning. I want to be the best version of myself. You see? And yes, we need a little bit more time to talk about it in one of the future sessions as well.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's very interesting. And so I think, hopefully for the audience, then when they come across the concept of Ishvara Pranidhana, at least it's sort of a reinforcement about being able to, achieve that highest self of being for yourself, right? That satisfaction that comes with it, and also constantly pushing yourself to live a life that's, as complete and as whole, if you will, right? By the time it's time for us to leave this world, right? And having no regrets around, that you didn't and weren't able to do so for whatever reason it may be. So I know we're running low on time. It's very hard to stop these discussions because there's so much more to kind of delve into and the specifics and the nuances. So we can definitely touch upon these concepts in a little bit more depth in future topics. And I think it also, again, is super interesting in just how this discussion itself, we've identified so many different ways that these different concepts within the Niyamas, right, are interconnected, but also beyond the Niyamas themselves, right? How all these different concepts and the different sectors or sub niches, if you will, within each of these different limbs of yoga all tie together into this one complete and sort of cohesive picture together. So I think that's another thing that I hope our audience is taking away from it. I know I definitely am. But when we have, we have a last few minutes here for this podcast today. So I think what would be nice to touch upon, and I think these two things go hand in hand, is what are the benefits, right, of these yamas and niyamas more at a practical level? And if we take a step back and kind of think holistically about the yamas and the niyamas, what are the benefits? And then what, practical advice would our audience and even myself, benefit from in terms of how to not get swept away by the thoughts that may impede us living a life that is consistent with the principles put forth in the yamas and niyamas? So basically, what are the benefits? And practically speaking, we can have, many different episodes on what are the practical implications of the yamas and niyamas, but at a high level, in maybe just a couple of minutes, practically speaking, what advice would you have, Shriramji, on, being able to live a life that's in accordance with these principles?
Yes, in fact, Patanjali helps us there in the Yoga Sutras. After he enumerates the yamas, the 5 yamas and the 5 niyamas, he says how to deal with any thought that comes in the mind that goes against these principles. For example, suppose the mind is swept away by emotion of anger, suddenly it gushes into the mind. And in that fit of anger, perhaps they are about to say some hurtful words. So if they say it out, then perhaps they are going against the principle of ahimsa. So there, Patanjali has a very beautiful insight to offer. He says, the sutra goes, Vitarka bhadane pratipaksha bhavanam. That means rather than trying to stop the violence from being expressed, plant an opposite thought of compassion. You see, in other words, uh, it actually harnesses a secret of the mind, namely, it is very difficult to push away a thought in the mind. You cannot resist a thought because it will persist. What you resist will persist in the mind. For example, if you want to forget an elephant, can you push the elephant away from your mind? You see, the more you try to push the thought away, the more securely it lodges itself in the mind. You see, and here is where Patanjali gives a trick. He says, don't try putting effort into pushing the thought of um, the himsa away from the mind, but plant the seed of the opposite, which aligns itself with yamas and niyamas. Instead of trying to push away anger, welcome compassion, welcome kindness, because wherever we pour our awareness, it grows.
So sorry, can we clarify that one more time? So instead of pushing away the thought of anger, for example, you want to bring in the thought of compassion.
Exactly.
And so practically speaking, so the way that works is that you will basically like override the negative thought with the positive thought, or is it like sort of a way where you want to positively reinforce that positive, compassionate thought and then based on that suppress the negative thought? Is that the way to look at it? So basically the number of repetitions you keep dwelling on your mind for that negative thought basically goes down, and the positive thought now surfaces to take up more brain space, more brain power, so that you're thinking more positively as opposed to negatively. Is that the way you should be thinking about that, or did I misinterpret?
Yeah, that is a good way to think about it. But the principle is that wherever we pour our awareness, that grows. So whenever we think of something, it doesn't matter what the sponsoring thought behind is, whether we want to push it away or to welcome it. We are still thinking about that object, right? It doesn't matter what the sponsoring thought behind it is. The fact that we are thinking about it, that we are placing it in our awareness, it grows. So for example, if you want to push away anger, when you're trying to push anger away, your awareness is on anger. So the anger will grow, you see?
Yeah.
So that's why when you replace that with compassion, what happens is your awareness is on compassion. So the compassion will grow and anger will wither away because of lack of attention to it.
Perfect. So I think that's exactly what I was getting at, just probably not as in those kind of articulate words. So exactly, right? So you basically want to take up more brain space with a positive thought, because that then reinforces itself, and you kind of then let the negative thought drifts away and drifts off. So no, that's a very interesting point. And I think that's something that hopefully, our audience, and I mean, I know myself definitely will keep in mind. And so if I were to summarize maybe the last 2 weeks worth of discussions on the yamas and the niyamas, what comes to mind is that we have these set of principles, right, that are first of all very interconnected and that go hand in hand. And a lot of these things are, first of all, there's a very literal definition. There's also a much more abstract, a much more deeper level when you really think about the definition of each of these different core concepts or terms. And the other thing to note probably is that these are also a lot of internally guided, internally enforced concepts, right? So these are not things that, for example, have societal guidelines. I mean, to a high level you do, but when we delve a level deeper, right, a lot of these things are things you have to personally police yourself with or personally enforce in order to really understand and embrace what they actually mean, right? So, and then the last thing I would say is that from a practical perspective, in terms of translating this into actual useful, like a toolkit that's actually useful and you can employ day to day, a lot of it is probably the awareness, right? So before you, for example, react passively to a situation, instead, before you have that reaction or that thought even comes to mind, whatever circumstance it may be, right? Take a moment to actually think it through and try to bring the positive aspect, the positive thought into your mind as opposed to the negative thought, so that you can react in a way where you basically are not doing any harm to others, not harboring any kind of unintentional thoughts in the external world. But then internally, you're also not hurting yourself because you're thinking about solving these problems in a way where it's incredibly efficient, where you're thinking calmly and rationally through a solution and not, thinking emotionally and illogically. So I think if I were to think about, the yamas and niyamas, that's the way I would kind of sum up the discussion that we've had for the past 2 weeks. But definitely, Shriramji, please, feel free to add any layer of detail to that, to the extent that you see differently.
Thanks, Vedantji. That was a very beautiful summary. I'll just add a couple of very quick points. So in addition to giving insights about how we can practicalize the wisdom of yamas and niyamas, Patanjali also gives the benefits of each of the 5 yamas and each of the 5 niyamas. So what happens when we consistently abide by these principles? And I'll just give a couple of examples. And for those interested, you can do Swat Dhaya. You can do self-inspired study and find out what are the benefits of all the 10. So let's look at the examples of ahimsa. Ahimsa is non-violence, the first yama. So when we consistently abide by ahimsa, when we're always kind, then what happens is, Patanjali says, ahimsa pratisthayam tat sannidau vairatyagaha. That means in the presence of one who is established in ahimsa, anger or violent thoughts in other people's mind will simply wither away when they come in the presence of such a yogi. You see? So it's like in the presence of light, you cannot have darkness, right? Because darkness is just absence of light. So like that, in the presence of a yogi who is established in ahimsa, people who approach them, their violent thoughts in their mind will simply disappear. So this is a very profound statement that Patanjali makes. And like that for Satya, for example, the second yama, Satya, he says, Satya pratishtayam kriya phalashvayatvam. All the actions that we do will be fulfilled more easily. They will succeed more easily when we abide by Satya. Or another way to state is that whatever truthful person, yogi who is established in Satya, whatever they say will manifest in reality. You can say the universe will make it true. Whatever words they say, the universe will ensure that the statement is made true. So like that, Patanjali gives these which are profound benefits of these yamas and niyamas. Let's look quickly at one more from the niyama category. So Shoucha, cleanliness. In fact, he gives 2 benefits for Shoucha. He says, Swanga jugupsa paraira samsargaha. That means when a person is established in cleanliness, then their attachment to their body will wither away. In other words, they will see clearly that I am different from the body. So, for example, if they experience a tummy ache, to give a very simple example, they will still be at peace with it because they will see the body as something external. Okay, something's going on in the body level. I'm not the body, so I am not too concerned about it. So that level of not getting perturbed comes into picture. So that is one benefit. And the other benefit, he also says, when a yogi is established in cleanliness, then the mind becomes crystal clear. Sattva shuddhi, saumanasya, ekagra, the single pointed focus comes to them. And like that, he gives benefits to the mind. When cleanliness is established, mind becomes clear. So like that, he gives the positive benefits of abiding by these yamas and niyamas.
Wonderful. Thank you for filling in the gaps with that. I think that really rounds out our discussion and hopefully gives our audience, I know it definitely has given myself, I think a much more not only comprehensive view of the yamas and the niyamas, but also more importantly, how should we actually think about these, right, in our daily lives, and how should we think about actually applying these concepts, right, in a way where we can actually do it at a human level, right? And so, but again, I think that further goes back to the goal of the podcast, right, which is to understand how we can apply these principles and these practices to our daily lives, because one level is to really understand conceptually what these things mean, but the other aspect is to then figure out, okay, what's the actual translatable, right, utility of these various different concepts. And so I think we really addressed that really well with the yamas and niyamas the past 2 weeks. So hopefully our audience feels the same way. But with that, why don't we go ahead and I think close out the discussion for today. I think we've covered the yamas and niyamas. So why don't we give our audience a little bit of time to reflect on that and kind of think through the different concepts and points we were able to discuss in the last 2 podcasts. And so we'll be continuing with the next set of limbs in the Ashtanga Yoga sequence over the next couple of podcasts. So definitely please, to our audience, feel free to tune in and listen to the podcast. We'll be covering these different topics over the next couple of weeks. But with that, thank you once again, Shriramji, for the wonderful explanations on the yamas and the niyamas. And with that, we'll go ahead and conclude for today.
Thank you. Thank you
Thank
all.
you.
Thank you, Vedanji.